Hello and welcome to this edition of Books by NewsX. I'm Megha Sharma, and joining me on the telecast today is Mr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Krishnamurthy Subramanian is one of the best economists that the country has seen. He was the chief economic advisor to India. He has also been the executive director of India to the International Monetary Fund, and he also is a professor at the Indian School of Business. Thank you, Mr. Subramanian, for joining me on the telecast, joining me on this show.
My pleasure, Megha.
And my first question to you, of course, is about all this talk that we have about Viksit Bharat at 2047. But what is the blueprint? What is the vision? And you've come up with this book about India at 100. And when you talk about India at 100, why did you decide to have this book today? Why did you decide to publish it? What was the vision behind doing this?
So, Megha, when I was part of the government in the last few months, the India at 75 activities were going on. And naturally, of course, the sights went to what the economy will be at 100. And that's when the seeds for this book got germinated. And I had the privilege of writing 3 economic surveys where I had, done a thematic coverage in the volume once, of the economic strategy for a $5 trillion economy, ethical wealth creation, and also the post-COVID economy. And those helped because thinking deeply about these issues, actually, I was able to benefit from that and thereby be able to put out, what I think is a vision for the economy when India turns 100. One of the other drivers was that I fundamentally believed that for positive outcomes to manifest, positive thinking is necessary. But for negative outcomes to manifest, oftentimes negative thinking is sufficient. And so positive thinking oftentimes has to work harder to highlight some of the positivities, which there are inevitably, in the Indian economy. So this book is therefore an exercise to lay out what is the undoubted potential of the Indian economy, and what India needs to do to really fructify this potential by the time it turns 100. So I'll give a parallel using a passion of mine, cricket. Sachin Tendulkar, we all know, is all his achievements in cricket. But when he had just started playing cricket for a few years in 1993, based on his performance, in those 4 years, Sunil Gavaskar had said that if he doesn't score at least 40 international hundreds and 12,000 international runs, I'll personally go and strangle him. It was, of course, a paternalistic statement talking about the potential that Sachin had, and potential was itself assessed based on past performance. In a similar way, based on the performance of the Indian economy over the last 30 years, I'm assessing India's potential. Of course, I have no claims to be the Sunil Gavaskar of anything, but that is actually based on past performance. I'm assessing the potential. There's an important lesson beyond that, which is that like Sachin Tendulkar did, he had to work hard. It's just that just because Sunil Gavaskar said, those 15,000 international runs, 100 hundreds didn't happen. He had to work very hard, and it also had to get over setbacks. In a similar way, India, the state governments and the central government have to work together to deliver 8% growth. And if we do that, we can be a $55 trillion economy and thereby be the Sachin Tendulkar of the global economy.
That's fantastic. Talking about the 8% growth, are we at this point of time at the sustained level of growing at this 8%? And will this then take us to the $55 trillion economy mark, as you mentioned?
So, if you look at historically, our growth rate in real terms has been about 7%. So 8% is a little bit of a stretch goal, but I think which is something that is good. It's ambitious, but it is achievable. And the reason I think it is achievable is that if there are 3 key drivers, of course there are others. Across 27 chapters, I've covered many different aspects that India can, work on as part of policy to be able to deliver this growth over the next 23 years. I want to highlight 3 aspects, 3 drivers here. One, which is formalization of the economy. Unlike, for instance, many of the advanced economies which have been formal for the times that we know of, the Indian economy still continues to be, a large part of it is informal. estimates vary, but anywhere between half to 2/3 of the economy is informal. And formalization will enhance productivity. When you think about growth comes primarily from two sources, which is the investment that is made and the return on that investment, which is productivity. So formalization, will enable productivity, because formal sector firms are far more productive than informal sector firms. Second, even our formal sector firms themselves are actually far behind global peers. Anywhere between maybe 1/4 or 1/5 of the productivity of global firms. And given the momentum that we've gathered on innovation and on entrepreneurship, firms basically, our formal sector firms will also catch up with global peers, and that will also spur productivity growth. Finally, a very important lever that India, there's a long runway, it is credit creation, and credit creation for, small firms that can grow, create jobs in the process, become more productive. And I want to highlight some data here. If you look at the private credit to GDP ratio, which basically is a proxy for how much credit penetration there is in the country, India's private credit to GDP ratio in 2020 was 58%. The global average in 1960, in other words, 6 decades back, was 60%. So we still have about 6 decades to catch up on credit creation. And credit creation, is basically as the lifeblood of the economy. Think about it yourself, or, common people. If you have an idea, if you want to convert it into a business, you of course need the financing, and credit is really critical. So being able to increase this credit will deliver, significant economic opportunities. And here I want to, point out a sort of a very specific example, India versus South Korea. Again, let's take the 1960 to 2020 period. In 1960, South Korea's private credit to GDP ratio was 6%. India was 8%. In other words, India was ahead of South Korea. Fast forward 6 decades, they are at 178%. We, have been languishing at 58%. And what's the benefit of that? If you look at today, India, we buy Daewoo cars, we buy Samsung phones, because that credit went into manufacturing, into export-intensive sectors. And in the book, I actually show that, if it had been the reverse, if India had that kind of credit penetration, that kind of credit growth, it could have been reversed, where we would have been exporting our cars and our phones to them. So that, in some sense, also illustrates the kind of, opportunity there is for credit penetration to actually lead to, equitable and sustained economic growth. So these three drivers themselves actually can deliver 8%, but also there are others: human capital, education, healthcare, that's important, bureaucratic reforms, judicial reforms. There are also aspects that can be focused on digital economy, digitization, So in summary, what I would say is there are, fruits that are hanging at different levels. And, some of the low-hanging fruits are the ones that I've explained in more detail. Once we plug them actually, and then we've eaten them, we can go on to other fruits. And thereby there's enough work for us to be able to do in the next 20-25 years to deliver that 8% growth, which can lead to the $55 trillion economy.
Okay. You've also described in detail about ethical wealth creation.
Yes.
What does it mean, if you could explain to us?
I have felt this, need for our common people to understand the importance of wealth creation for the, economic welfare of common people. Because oftentimes I see a lot of demagoguery, which creates this artificial tension between, wealth creation is not good for common people, or that's the way it is portrayed. So I want to, share a couple of examples here to illustrate this point. I go back to my own childhood. I come from a humble background, lower middle class family. I spent, all my childhood in type 2 quarters, railway quarters. So my father was in the, non-gazetted cadre in the Indian Railways, and, we used to have a help who would come and, help my mother wash dishes. Now this help actually used to work in 9 other families, and there were some months we would not be able to afford, but in those months, even when we were able to afford, we were one among 10 families that were basically was giving this house help a job. In other words, this lower middle class family, our middle class, lower middle class, any other lower middle class family was providing 1/10 of a house help job. In contrast, the rich man who in our town, Bilaspur, he was a jeweler. Between his business and his home, he was actually providing jobs to about 100 people. So just in terms of the number of jobs, he was creating 1,000 times as much jobs, because we were providing 1/10 and he's providing 100. So 1,000 times as much jobs in quantity. But even on quality, obviously the jobs that people who are working in his business or at his home were getting paid at least 4-5 times as much as the house help. So that also illustrates how, basically we were not creating that much wealth as lower middle class families, and we were not providing that much jobs either. He was creating a lot of wealth and he was providing jobs too. So that correlation is something that is important to understand. One more example let me give you actually, and here I say this with absolute independence, because consciously over my entire more than 2.5 decade academic career, I've never done any consulting for anybody. So I've not eaten anybody's salt, and therefore I can say things that is basically good for the economy. Take any industrialist, X, Y, or Z. It's what does that industrialist do in terms of with his or her wealth? They basically go and put it in companies. It's not as if they're stacking those 1,000 or maybe 2,000 rupee notes into their pillows or their mattresses and sleeping on them. They're in fact actually putting them to work in the companies. And in fact, even the third example, if you take basically yourself or me or our camera people here, they're all working in the private sector, and somebody created a private sector company who had the wealth to create, and that wealth creation is what is providing jobs to all of you. And I think the same thing would be true for our viewers as well. So I think this demagoguery that is indulged in, which is basically to make it seem as if wealth creation is bad for the common person's welfare, is actually very harmful for the economy. And that is why, using these examples, I want to illustrate so that these demagogues don't pull wool over our eyes by creating this artificial tension. Wealth creation, though, has to be fair and square. It should be ethical, and that is equally important as well, and that is why I'm emphasizing the ethical wealth creation. Okay. But the more important aspect, as I said, is that wealth creation and job creation, or what is good for common people, are basically symbiotic.
Okay. You talk about social welfare, the schemes that have been launched by the governments successively, one after another. We're talking about housing, we're talking about insurance, toilets, and so on and so forth. There seems to be a saturation point that they have arrived at.
Yep.
Do you think we as a country is growing socially at the pace that is needed to be grow?
Yes, but we need to do more. In the last 10 years, if you look at talked about sanitation, and there's ample evidence now which shows that the improvement in sanitation has reduced deaths that are transmitted through water. Whether it's cholera deaths or malaria deaths, those have actually reduced. About 3 lakh deaths have actually been avoided because of sanitation, and that affects general health as well, because if you don't fall sick, you can actually go and productively contribute to the economy. You can go to work, right? And that is something that is important. At the same time, if you look at, for instance, gas cylinders that have been given to women, not only has that made them more productive, what they might have taken, let's say 3-4 hours to actually cook the day's meal, they now can do it in maybe an hour and a half, and that frees up time that they're able to put to use maybe in agricultural work or maybe other work, and maybe they're able to pay more attention to their children, and that has helped. So if you look at all these programs, these have really helped in improving the overall sort of lives of our people, and that saturation is something that actually was a necessary aspect which has happened. But now what is really critical for us to be able to scale the next level or next peak in social and economic inclusion, jobs in the formal sector are extremely critical. And that's an aspect that I emphasize a lot in the, and for that, manufacturing sector growth is really critical, because manufacturing sector provides jobs, and and I think, again, I can go back and actually, just using my own personal, if my father, for instance, did not have a job in the Indian Railways, there's no way he would have been able to educate us. And me and my younger brother, both of whom actually were able to get very good education, none of that would have transpired. And that's again illustrative of the power of a good job to actually change the fortunes of generations. And that is something that we need to do in order for, that's the next peak that India needs to scale in the effort to basically socially and economically include our people.
Okay. In a federal structure such as ours, the state governments have to make a number of decisions.
Absolutely.
How do we ensure this coordination is smooth?
So, I'm glad you asked this question. It's a very good question. See, in a federal structure, states and center both have responsibilities. When one looks at some of the political conversations that happen, the power of states is talked about. But the flip side of that, which is basically responsibility, is oftentimes not emphasized enough. And this is an aspect that both media, industry bodies, all of them actually need to highlight. I'll just give a simple example. Take, for instance, the budget. There's an entire set of activities that happen in and around the union budget. Lots of attention on it, rightly so. But if you take some of the state budgets, there isn't even a whimper about it. but I think that there should be at least some of the developed states, their budgets need to be, focused on as much, analyzed as much. And questions are saying, why hasn't basically, what are the policy reforms that have been brought in? What has been done to basically enable manufacturing? What has been done to, to improve our roads? What has been done to improve our sanitation, etc.? These questions need to be asked. And industry bodies like CII, FICCI, ASSOCHAM, they need to actually hold sessions. When the Maharashtra budget is presented, or the Gujarat budget, or the Tamil Nadu budget, or Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, these budgets, when they're presented, they need to actually be, and I'm picking up because these are some of our developed states, and they need to be contributing, they need to be setting the agenda. So our industry bodies need to actually unravel these budgets, and media needs to ask the same questions. In other words, it is time now that at least a few state budgets actually become as critical as the central government budget. And I'll give you a parallel here. Just before I flew from the United States, the Consul General in New York, they asked me to do an event or sort of share some thoughts on the Indian budget. And there were many Americans who were actually paying attention to. So in other words, in the global economy today, the Indian budget is paid attention to. Similarly, in the Indian economy now, many of these states' budgets actually need to be paid attention to. And I think it's a responsibility of media professionals like you and industry bodies to actually bring that attention on these, because that's how good policies at the state level will happen.
Okay. What, according to you, has been the single most important contribution by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in energizing the India growth story?
I think the self-confidence, the fact that we can indeed, even a once-in-a-century crisis like COVID, that happened, the way we, have emerged out of that, and I think the contrast to the previous crisis is really telling. The previous crisis, global financial crisis, if you look at, we entered the global financial crisis in very good, economic health, but we exited out being part of the fragile five. In contrast, COVID, we actually entered with growth slowdowns, and as a result, credit rating agencies actually downgrading our outlooks, and the economy actually was not in as good shape. But we've exited out with very strong macro fundamentals, and also 7% plus consistent growth. Not only that, if you go back, and I think I would like to remind our viewers, if you go and check some of the assessments that were made by universities like Ivy League universities like Princeton or John Hopkins in May of 2020, I remember because I was actually in the government, I was reading these very carefully. Many of them were saying that the millions of people that were going to die in India, due to COVID, none of which happened. And I think that is actually something that is credit to. So it has, the way we've responded to this crisis, and for the first time since independence, I think we've actually done better than the advanced economies. It provides a confidence saying that, yes, we can do it. And I think that to me, is really, very important, because I am a, fundamental believer that whether it's at the individual level or at the national level, having that self-confidence makes a hell of a difference.
Talking about these chaotic situations that are taking place in the Indian neighborhood, whether we talk about Bangladesh, where there's a coup that has happened, we talk about Sri Lanka, the massive debt crisis, talk about Pakistan, it has perpetually been a belligerent nation to India. Maldives, there is again, belligerence that has been shown from the
Correct,
Maldivian Prime Minister.
But there's been good improvement now in the Maldives, I think especially in the relationship, but go on.
So how do you view, and now there are these perceptions that are being created, questions being put on India and the economy and the government, talking about how there could be a similar situation that could be seen in India itself. How do you view this?
See, first of all, I think, to your last point, there's a phenomenal amount of difference between the other countries that you spoke about and India. So I don't even want to waste my time speculating on all this. I don't think any of this stuff that basically has been tried in other countries is something that is possible in India. Let me be categorical about that. Now, as for the challenges that you spoke about, and I think, absolutely, I do recognize that, there will be challenges during a 2-decade, 25-year period. There will of course be challenges. But let me give you some examples, and this should sort of hopefully provide the confidence. Let me take the example of Japan. From 1970 to 1995, Japan grew its economy 25 times, from about $215 billion to about $5.5 trillion. Now, was this a period that was a honeymoon for the economy or for the Japanese economy? No. This was a period where the war was going on, the Vietnam War. There was the big oil shock, which basically led to hyperinflation, in the US and other countries, so which would have, of course, affected global demand. And yet during that period, Japan grew by its GDP by 25 times. Or if you take China, from 1996 to 2021. That's a period where there's a global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, 2009. There's COVID. There's actually the recent war, and yet China has grown its economy 22 times. I think in the real world there always will be challenges, but I think it's good leadership always looks for opportunities in challenges. And those that are often cynical, I think, look for challenges in every opportunity. I would rather prefer to actually look for opportunities in these challenges.
Okay, we at NewsX have also been carrying out a number of these campaigns, whether you talk about the space sector, semiconductor sector. We've been getting panelists, we've been trying to put out these solution-oriented telecasts and what should be the guidelines, what should be the blueprint in the coming years, decades ahead. Which are these core sectors, core industries that must be built in India and at a fast-paced phase?
I would emphasize manufacturing. I've covered that in great detail. I think manufacturing, given our young population, jobs are really important, as I mentioned, and manufacturing sector therefore is really critical because it can provide jobs. A formal sector job also can spur consumption, because think about it, at our own individual, household level, if we basically know that we're going to get salaries every month, we can plan our consumption better. I would go and buy, let's say, a durable good if I know that I have the salary to be able to, certain salary to be able to take care of the EMIs. But if I, for instance, think, I might get an income this month, but maybe not next month, I would not be able to go and, buy that durable good. In other words, uncertainty has a significant impact on consumption at the household level. And then when you actually accumulate at the macroeconomy, it has an impact. So jobs are really critical, not only for social and economic inclusion, they're also critical from, for basically social economic inclusion, at the level of the macroeconomy. So manufacturing sector is really critical. Also, one more dimension which I would want to highlight. As our economy will grow, you'll have a large middle class that will get created as well. And this middle class will need, the refrigerators, the televisions, the phones, the cameras, and all these manufactured products. And if we don't produce them in India, we will have to import all of that. That will have an impact on our trade deficit, thereby current account deficit, and our external sector. And I think it is important, therefore, to actually, the emphasis on Atmanirbhar Bharat on this, the manufacturing, domestic manufacturing is as critical from a macroeconomic perspective as well. So overall, I would emphasize, manufacturing, but at the same time, climate change is an area, I think, being able to, focus on some of the sustainable ways of growth is also equally critical, and that's an area that also we should be focusing on.
Okay, talking about P.V. Narasimha Rao when he was the Prime Minister in 1990s, do you feel Prime Minister Narendra Modi has brought about that fundamental change in our country in the last 10 years, and of course the next 5 years that he's going to be governing the country, that we look back and say that this period has been the second phase of India unleashed?
I would have no hesitation, in acknowledging that. So let's give credit where it's due. I think P.V. Narasimha Rao, was somebody actually who made a big difference, because liberalized the economy, but for that liberalization, we wouldn't be here talking about these, this potential. At the same time, as I mentioned, Prime Minister Modi's contribution has been in highlighting that, among many things, one, that wealth creation is something that is important. It is, it shouldn't be seen as a bane, it should be seen as a boon. This mindset change actually, especially given our socialist, era and the residues of which actually oftentimes prevail in economic thought, I think that is really critical. At the same time, what Prime Minister Modi has done is to show that you can really provide. You can do good policies that really enable the poor to actually develop capabilities and thereby also, make it good politics. And I think that is an aspect, that's an important lesson, that in other words, good economics can be good politics. That is something that first he demonstrated it at the state level, and then at the union government level as well. That to me is an important lesson, because I grew up oftentimes actually hearing that good economics does not make for good politics. And as an economist, that is not something that was ever music to my ears. But being able to demonstrably show that good economics can make for good politics, there's a critical element there, which is that communicating that, I think that is equally important. With that, is being able to demonstrate that uplifting people and doing welfare programs in a very efficient manner is something that he's demonstrated. And finally, as an engineer, what I actually really like is the use of technology. Having had the privilege to be able to work very closely with him, I've been fascinated by how he thinks about the applications of technology, and that's something which actually it's clearly demonstrated. Look at the kind of digital public infrastructure that we've created, the kind of pilferage we've reduced in our welfare programs using technology. Those are all actually the benefits that have come from having a leader who understands the power of technology to be able to bring transformative change.
Absolutely. And I also want to understand from you, yes, job creation, top priority, but are there systemic risks to then the virtuous cycle that you talk about?
So I think risks will be there, as we were discussing earlier as well. I was giving you the example of Japan and China, where they, grew despite challenges. Risks will be there, and I think, in the coming years, it's possible some of the global factors may, increase risks as well. But, we have to actually handle them, and especially through good policy, focused on investment, and building, high quality infrastructure that enables the creation of physical, digital, and human capital. We should be able to actually deliver that 8% growth that can make us a $55 trillion economy when we turn 100.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for joining me, talking to us on this special show, on this special edition, and wishing you all the very best, and congratulations once again for the release of India at 100.
My pleasure, Megha.